Hello, welcome to another conversation with the Wardley mapping community. This episode I'm really excited about. It's taken a while to set up, but it's all come together today just before Christmas. Before I introduce today's guest, I'm delighted to be joined by not one, but two members of the Wardley mapping community. So first up, Ben Mosior. We all know Ben. If you don't, just Google him. But say hello, Ben. How are you?
Hello, thanks so much for having me, John. I'm super excited about our guests today.
Anything caught your eye recently?
I'm gonna I don't know what the proper etiquette for this is, but I'm going to be a little bit self-referential. John, you and Chris Daniel had an awesome conversation recently with Vikesh Shaw, and I just found myself just challenged in some interesting ways, and I think Vikesh and I have some interesting and overlaps in the way that we view mapping and so on. And his thinking in the retail space I thought was really helpful. Not to mention, I think in general, we're hoping more people share industry specific maps and host conversations around them so that more people can learn. And I've just found that whole thing to be really exciting and engaging. So hopefully we can put a link to that somewhere. What about you, John? What has caught your eye in the Wardley mapping community lately?
Well, it was a tweet, and it was a retweet by Chris Daniels. So can you see my screen?
Yep.
So it's this one. If you're playing EVE Online, you basically already have an MBA. So I thought that was quite interesting. So as any good researcher does, I went to Wikipedia. Because I'm not a video game player, by the way, but I like to learn what's in vogue, what's happening, and how technology is evolving in this space. So I started to read this and I thought, oh, that name rings a bell. So as any good researcher does, I just went back to Twitter and I tweeted Andy. And a really interesting response. There are many ways to play EVE. Not all of them lead to this kind of learnings, but many playing styles do. EVE's market is a true player-driven market. So the kind of decisions that you need to make about supply, demand, profit margins, people management to be successful in the marketplace are very real.
Ooh, I like that.
So there's lots of things that spring out to me here. Obviously markets, decision-making, dealing with complexity, collaboration, but the overriding one is learning. So now I'm going to link to our guest through this by explaining a bit of what I'm interested in, which is the future of work and the impact of machine intelligence and automation, what that will have on the future of work. And what's apparent to me is lifelong learning needs to become the norm, not the exception. And for many years now, and incidentally, this isn't academic research, this is just research that's quite, it's so obvious to me, and yet collectively, we're not in a position to be able to adapt. So I think learning through gameplay, especially soft skills and skills such as I've just outlined there, complexity, collaboration, and they're also transferable, as Andy's indicated in her tweet. But the other thing I'd like to touch on, as I have a background in software engineering, and software engineers are kind of used to having to learn continuously. So how do software engineers do that? They read books, they go online, they engage with forums, and often they will just read source code. They will read test scripts. But that doesn't apply to other industries. Now, our guest today is Sue Borchardt. Some of you may have come across her epic animations online. And in October, she published an animation that includes Wardley mapping. As a visual person, and a person that also kind of likes to learn through listening, animations such as Sue's really appeal to me because they're able to condense such a lot of information and engage people, make learning accessible with really difficult topics such as systems thinking and complexity and Wardley mapping. And they can act as a springboard to take people to the next level and really give people an insight of what a subject is about and what's involved. Now, I've looked online, Sue, and your CV is very long indeed. So as host, I should try and put you a point rather than go through every institution that you've been involved with and projects, and just start by asking you to elaborate on what you call yourself, which is a research artist. And there's people outside the Wardley mapping community who are interested in your work as well. So that was one of the things that have come up with other people. And also, perhaps go on to explain what motivated you to produce this animation that included Wardley mapping, and anything that's memorable from that, any points that stood out, any loose ends that you think you have in that you'd like to explore or revisit. So that's the link and that's the introduction. So over to you, Sue.
Thanks, John. So it's really, as you might imagine, it's really hard to figure out where to start, because where I found myself now is sort of very multidisciplinary. I mean, I started out life as an artist. I became a software engineer after majoring in electrical engineering. I also changed my major about 5 times. And then I was a massive slacker for a few years, working in a local Whole Foods, and eventually found my way to the context of learning about learning. And I thought I was interested in neuroscience, but that really led me to collective learning. I mean, I was interested in neuroscience, but what I found was that the parallels were uncanny, you know, how collections of neurons learn and how collections of people learn. The learnings informed one another. So that gives you a little bit of sort of the flow of how I got to the research artist part. And I discovered complexity as a meditator, and that was sort of my avenue into neuroscience. I discovered Francisco Varela, who was one of the finders of the Mind and Life organization, who was also an immunologist who got complexity, you know, immune systems learn. It's fascinating. But so I was so curious about how learning happened. So that really is what led me to this space of how collective learning happens and how we're making sense of things, and how that interface between sort of interior psychology, which had been my home base, you know, until I arrived at the sort of collaborative learning space. Not surprising, as an engineer, you tend to be sort of good at focus work. Same with artists, like good at focus work. Lots of hours of introversion. but the interfaces between us are where things kind of get bogged down. That was the real frustration for me, and one of the reasons I left software, because my team was not greater than the sum of its parts. We were a bunch of big egos bouncing off each other and not serving. I mean, we were cranking out stuff for our shareholders, but in the big picture, we ended up sort of fueling big pharma. I was at a biotech company when I finally left. And so one of the things that puzzles me around Wardley is, I mean, I have a lot of questions that have come after that animation. And that was my point. The reason I got into animation is because through this sort of varela seeds that took me through to complexity, it's too big. The insights of complexity are always going away. They're always falling out of my head. And so in any situation, there's so many dimensions that I'm having to, always carve out what's salient, what's relevant in this conversation or this context or my particular role. And it's frustrating because I can't visualize that. It's impossible. And I really appreciate what Simon Wardley has done in trying to give us another way to articulate that visually and spatially, really resting on those, what we know about the evolutionary dynamics. And so time gave me one more dimension. In animation, I've got 2.5 dimensions because I don't work 3D. I can layer stuff, I can move them around in time. And so that's it was an accident. I was in grad school trying to make sense of things, and I didn't really get a lot out of writing the essays and doing the assignments. They didn't help me, but they were the ask at Harvard. You gotta go figure. You gotta do the assignment. But my window into animation, or the crack that I sort of expanded, was when we did a module. This was in the Mind, Brain, and Education core course. And we did a module on something called Universal Design for Learning, which was really based on neuroscience and how we need these multiple media modes of getting information and expressing information in order to deepen our understanding. And so I was like, can I do something that's not an essay for the assignment on Universal Design for Learning? And the first response was no. And my retort was, what do you not get about Universal Design for Learning? Apparently I'm not very political or politically savvy. So that was how animation came into the mix. I know that was a very long answer. Sorry about that.
It was a perfect answer. That was amazing.
The sun is actually moving. I'm going to have to shift while we continue. Don't mind me. I'm going to mute myself.
Well, I'm going to put the question back to you, Sue, and go back to when you're actually scripting the animation. Can you recall how you were inspired, the motivation to use the elements that you did do? Which stand out to you? Which did you think were actually, that's really effective? I've really made the point there. Because what I'd like to do with that answer is to try and unravel a bit why you think animation is so effective for learning, and especially lifelong learning for adult education. And if anybody wants to jump in while Sue gets the Californian sunlight.
I know. Well, actually, I'm in Baltimore.
Baltimore.
But I think I've gotten myself a few more inches here. Collapsible tables, hackable spaces. So for me, it's the dynamics of self, the dynamics of learning, the dynamics of interaction that are so often missing from representations. So I don't think I do a very good job of that at all, frankly, in my animations, because I'm hamstrung by my current set of tools. Whereas when I was younger and I was a graphics programmer, I mean, these things lend themselves much better to math. And the tools that I use in After Effects, hand drawing and making things move, you're really limited. You don't even have a global variable. You get these little scripting windows in After Effects. It's the creative constraint that I have chosen to work in, at least up until this point. And so that shifts the focus on storytelling. It shifts the focus to sort of good enough. Like, what's a good enough way of using movement and metaphor to engage with another mind somewhere else in the world? And I don't necessarily sift through things to see, you know, what does someone need to hear? I come from the space of what am I really puzzled about? And that was the motivation for the Wardley mapping, because I'm on a local committee for peace and social justice with my local Quaker meeting. And somebody had mentioned that maybe we should consider getting strategic about our work. And I was like, ooh, strategic, let's, yes. So I whip out Wardley mapping, and I immediately realized that everyone in the room has a different idea about what strategy is. And so, you know, I'm like going back to first principles with Simon's kind of pitch and his book, and his keynotes. I mean, I binge watch Simon keynotes for fun. And his story, the way he brings you to how he arrived at Wardley mapping is the really interesting part to me. It's far more interesting than the exercise of mapping itself, is these principles that got him to this point. And so first I had to kind of go back to this notion of strategy cycle and doctrine. You know, I mean, it's interesting because the Quakers are pretty dogma free. You know, we don't even have a leader. Like, we just sit in silence. And yet there is doctrine. It's not that we want to achieve peace by any means. In the conflict field, they call that negative peace, when you just shut everybody up and zip it. And it's peaceful in that there's not violence or dissent, but it's an oppressive peace. So there is doctrine there. And so it's been a really interesting path to try and explore how to bridge the gap between peace building and something that's inherently kind of a competitive context of business. So that I hope that addresses some of what you asked in terms of what goes into the mix for the scripts and what kind of bubbles up from there.
I'd like to bring Andy in here by trying to make a comparison between gameplay and something which you're learning to apply. So a kind of applied science or theory. And what drew me into Wardley mapping is it's a framework really about learning. Okay, there's parts of it which is the gameplay, which people get very excited about. There's context specific, and then there's climactic patterns, which are universal patterns to look at. But even at a lower level than that, just the map itself, the value chain, you mentioned earlier before, Sue, which is time, and I think you mean evolution, don't you? The dimension that Wardley mapping has given you. And from a person who's a knowledge worker that works in tech, that does really resonate. You can start, it's not part of the learning curve. You see right through that and you jump straight into the collaboration side of things. Now, there's one opinion that I have that I kind of just throw around and try and get a response from people. And some people agree with it and some people don't disagree, but they're not fully bought in. And it's the idea that Wardley mapping is an emerging soft skill. Now, maybe not the strategic gameplay, but in terms of collaboration and being able to depersonalize storytelling. So it gets rid of conflict, and it allows people to start to make decisions and be in a agile or embrace agility. Now with Andy and your background of gameplay, that's kind of happening, but people don't think about it because they're enjoying themselves and they're playing a game. And if they lose, it doesn't matter. You go back to game zero. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, in EVE Online, you don't go back to zero and just start over again. And I guess that's what makes it so interesting. Like these are all virtual items, but they had to be acquired and built from resources, and if they blow up, they are gone. So in many parts of that particular game or society or socio-technical system that is this online universe and community, then it is very much shaped by that similarity to reality, that you can actually lose something that you have spent a lot of time and work on building up. And I think that that's maybe what makes it a laboratory for learning all kinds of skills. But listening to you, Sue, as well, and by the way, I just love that animation. It's really great. It's delightful. But when listening to you now in your journey, it makes me reflect, because in the last year in my work now, which is not on EVE Online anymore, but for Unity Technologies, which is a game engine, we think a lot about learning, because my team is trying to help beginners and people who are not programmers making things, to create things with the software. And so we think a lot about learning. And my reflection has actually been that there's some sort of I don't know, journey for learning itself that's happening, where it's maybe this time when learning has been seen as this separate activity is coming to an end, in a sense. That breaking the learning out was maybe like a glitch in history in some ways, that learning as the separate activity that has value on its own, that you do separated from the actual activity that you're expected to later do. That's interesting to me. It would be interesting to hear your reflection, Sue, but to continue my reflection a little bit more, we've tried to reshape how we think about getting people to a place where they can make stuff with this very complex software, and really try to actually have as little learning as possible. And Wardley maps have given me a view where, thinking about value chains, I think the real user need for us is creative expression. You're excited by the idea of making something, and then learning is a component, like a necessary component in that value chain for you to get that value of making something using a particular tool or technique, whether it's a software program or something else. It's sort of a necessary component, so you need to serve and satisfy that, because otherwise you're blocked, basically. But it is not necessarily the outcome itself. And I think this, because learning has been for a long time still a separated activity, you have people who are what I would call learning professionals, who are so focused on the learning itself that they sometimes forget about the sort of actual activity or outcome that is supposed to result from whatever it was that you learned, right? And I think I see a trend now of a couple of sites also who are trying to switch around this whole, I can't remember who it was, but it was somewhere in my Twitter feed, where someone going for courses which are just made up of activities. Instead of like courses made up of watching videos, they are courses made up of like, do this, now do this, and then do this. And then listening to you again, Sue, I think that is still the individual with the material. And there are completely new things that happen when you bring other people in, and when you have collective learning, and it's actually the people with each other and what happens in that learning process. So these are kind of some of my reflections that maybe don't have a lot to do with gameplay, but there is some journey in all of this, I think. And maybe the link back to gameplay is that people learn all these things not because they're interested in learning, but because the learning is a byproduct of them engaging in the activity and driving for some particular results. The people who do get an MBA out of EVE Online are the people who try to just beat the market. They're like, I'm going to get rich in this video game, and I'm going to figure out how to do arbitrage across regions, how to employ people who will mine the resources for me, how to employ the other people who would build like the transportation barges, and, you know, like actually making business in this game. And they do it because they want to buy more bigger spaceships or whatever. They're not doing it because they sort of think that they're going to learn business skills, right?
Can I just pick on something something there, Andy, that you said? So if we go back to where you said to me, well, actually in EVE, you've got risk. And if you lose, there's a cost to that loss. So you've got a kind of reinforcement learning happening there, which is different to Monopoly. it's real world. Do we think that, so in addition to the learning through collaboration that Wardley mapping can bring to the fore, because individuals from different departments and different levels in the hierarchy are involved with the collaboration, that you also become stakeholders. So similar to a gameplay where everybody is involved in the ecosystem, in the real world, if I can say that with Wardley mapping, if you're involved with drawing the map and refining the map, you then become a stakeholder. You then want to see the system or the project succeed. And that's something that may be missing. And I totally get what you just said then about learning, that it has to change. The idea that we do a degree and that's it, and saddle ourselves with huge amounts of debt. I think we'll look back in 10 years' time even and think, why did we do that? You know, it's more about small bits, learning to adapt. The problem I have is how we're going to do it, and which the multimodal aspects that you picked up on, Sue, earlier, what they actually are. Anyway, there was a question that you asked, Andy, to Sue, or can I pass that over to you, Sue?
I'm not sure what Andy's question was, but there was something that she said that really resonated with me. So I want to just leap into it. It's really fun that this conversation is happening right now, because 2 days ago I had to finish my final assignment for a conflict masters that I've sort of dipped my big toe into. And it was a proposal. It's supposed to be like a real world letter to a person in position of power. And I've been thinking a while about creating these spaces where we can learn the soft skill, as you mentioned, John, of Wardley mapping, but apply to the things that matter to us. And that may be just that matter to me as an individual when I walk in, but then through sort of talking with other people, I realized that we have some convergence, and we could actually, it could matter to us and turn into actual work. So I've had this idea for a while that I wanted to convene these spaces where people can play with Wardley mapping or any number of things, Innovator's Compass or polarity mapping, or, you know, the things that externalize collective thought together that we can actually engage in. And one of my colleagues, I mean, we have conversations once a week with a group, and we initially met at a Cynefin symposium in Wales a couple of years ago. And so this, I follow Mark on Twitter, and he, like a lot of us, will get like, we'll post some like floating idea. You have no idea what the context is. You only have, 144 characters. But he said something about tools being a not so great metaphor. And I realize I often think about Wardley maps, like I think of it as a tool. And it bugged me at first, but I'm like reading the Twitter thread and people are talking about craft and, it doesn't mean that there's not skill involved. And so I'm like pondering this for a while and thinking about how much resistance I encounter to picking up a pen and putting pen to paper in a group. And I see it all the time, no matter what the tool is. And which points again to this sort of soft skill, like, is it safe to play in this space? Is it safe to play? Because we can't map until we know how to map. We can't learn how to map without mapping, right? So I've been playing with this idea, which is what circling finally back to this journey word. I've been thinking about how if we enter these spaces together, I've been thinking of them as benevolent Trojan horses. They are vehicles, they are vessels, not that invaders come and sneak in with, but that we decide to go, let's go inside, we'll play for a while, it's totally safe. But when we come out, we're not the same as when we went in. We have changed, and we have, maybe not even in a big way, but it's an irreversible process to engage with a group and put pen to paper and think out loud. And so I love this idea of a journey, and I've been using it. I still don't know what the word is. I've been playing with, vessel and vehicle, and they're not very evocative. So my benevolent Trojan horses would be awesome, except for the fact that Trojan horses were the invaders. Oh, but if I can say one more thing about that, in this group that I meet with weekly, the sort of complexity thinkers in the applied space, many of whom are in the Agile community, yesterday's conversation was a deep dive into these notions of boundaries and permeability and immune systems, but particularly autoimmunity, when either as individuals we're trying to protect from something, or as groups around dissent. And so in some ways then this Trojan horse metaphor has some legs, because the benevolent Trojan horse, it's like, well, of course, whoever the Trojans were trying to attack and invade and overpower inside the walls of the whatever. Sorry, my history isn't so great. But you don't necessarily know when the horse comes in. Is it friend or foe? Is it us or them? Like those sorts of polarities and dichotomies are one of the things that really puzzle me around Wardley and the mapping technique, is that there's not a lot of loops represented. The loops are sort of stripped out of it in the dependencies in the value chain. And I suppose that works, especially if you take like a 30,000 foot view. Loops don't look like loops anymore, but it's still a puzzle for me, especially in how prevalent they are in doctrine. We don't just, have values around innovation because we don't want to shake the Etch-a-Sketch each time. Like, even if you could start, Eve, from like, oh, okay, I'm going to be a totally new person, I'm going to start from scratch. It's a little disheartening. It's like imagining going back to high school and starting from scratch and be like, ow, like, would I actually want to do that? So the tensions of stability and change they pervade that doctrine chunk of the strategy cycle. And I don't hear that talked about very often. And I've been digging a little deeper into, who's the guy, Sweeney, who wrote on John Boyd and sort of brought forward the more Byzantine version of Boyd's OODA loop that has like orientation is like this like little rat's nest of culture and experience. And that I'm sort of interested in going back to that little rat's nest, because I feel like that he lumps it all under orientation, but I feel like that's where the sticking points are. And how do we make it safe to share our orientations and our experiences long enough to co-create new stuff together. I'm realizing I'm extremely long-winded, and
I think it was super interesting reflections you have there, and responding to both what you were just talking about and to your questions, John. For me, I don't think that the Wardley mapping method per se inherently has any special sauce that makes for this like collaborative, stakeholdery type of process. I think that there are many other methods that can be used in a way to involve more people in the process and so on. I think that, and that is maybe this is a particular method that a couple of people who are not necessarily used to or skilled in that type of facilitation work have now picked up and are starting to learn a new field from scratch, more or less, and are all like, oh my God, like people can participate, and they're like, new things happen when it's not just sort of one person doing things. And I find this it's very interesting. But you said you started to talk about, it's an irreversible process. You step into a room with other people, and there's such a rich tradition for thinking about this in academia that has and also practice around play, where we have this concept of, you're even saying, is it safe to play, right? Because you have this concept of the magic circle that outlines what are the sort of play rules in this space, and what can I do here and what can I not. And what I have found is that we, from the play-driven community, we have actually a large toolbox for designing for participation. And I find that a lot of the people who have the big revelation when they either happen upon a process that is participatory by some inherent property, or sort of come to it new, they're sort of blown away. What happens is that they've just not necessarily worked explicitly with participation thinking, or really designing for participation. And the hack that I try to place in people's mind, usually just drawing upon all of this experience from that community that I come from, that actually works with live action role-playing games, where everyone's physically stepping into character. And in the Nordics, these games are very rules light. So it's much less sort of Dungeons and Dragons with dice and arbitrators in person, and much more improvisational theater, but with a first person audience. There's no external audience. Everyone who is participating is that's it, right? And when you design one of these games, you're, by definition, you have to design for participation, because each person has to step in and together with everybody else make this event exist. Unless everybody pretends that they're inside of the fiction of, say, an Ursula Le Guin, sci-fi planet type of world, unless everybody pretends, there is nothing. So when you design this experience, you have to make it from the ground up for people to participate in. And we can actually, there are many, many methods and thoughts for how to do this, right? To how to establish the safe play space, how to draw the boundaries, like draw the magic circle around what is allowed here, what are the social consequences of doing something here, can I feel safe, and answering all of these questions. And the hack that I try to place in people, which is also deeply inspired by the work of Kathy Sierra, who has like taught us to sort of drop our ego and stop thinking about, stop thinking about what users think of you and your product, and start thinking about what users think of themselves. Stop boasting about your camera with 1 million features. Start thinking about how you can make your user an awesome photographer, so that they tell other people that, oh, look at this picture I'm so proud of. And if you add a participation layer to this type of thinking, we stop being user-centric in the sense that we think about the user and the thing that we made, whether that's our Wardley map or something else that we care about, our product or whatever. And we start thinking about users with each other and mapping out that relationship network that matters. And looking at, so if we have a workshop situation or a learning situation where we're thinking together about how to do something and we want people to actually participate, then we have to look at those relationships and who are people, what roles can they potentially take when they come in. And if you're not the facilitator, you're coming in with a certain power dynamic and you're going to have all these questions like, what will people think of me? How can I participate here? There are all these social blockers because we all want to survive and not be like thrown out of our group, right? And so unless we resolve for those questions, we're very unlikely to get any meaningful participation. And so if I think back with those eyes on the whole, do Wardley maps sort of, does this knowing Wardley maps somehow magically draw out participation from stakeholders? And my answer would be no. Like, it can have some helping hands maybe, but as a method, it actually has an extremely steep learning curve. And the power dynamic that you're going to have to deal with is that if one person knows the technique already, like either you have to figure out how to get everyone on the same page, because otherwise it's going to be hard for them to collaborate because you have an expert in the room and nobody wants to say the wrong thing or do the method wrong or whatever. Or you're going to have to come up with some other way to package this to put everyone on the same kind of footing, right? Maybe pick one little part of it, or however you can design in a way that participants with each other are going to have a meaningful experience rather than participants with the thing.
Can I pick up on two things though? I just want to reflect back because I found that really fascinating. And I'm going to go back to Sue's Trojan horse. And something came into my mind as you were explaining that, which is emergence. And you also mentioned the OODA loop. And in the digital world that we're going through with automation and machine intelligence, innovation is going to accelerate and continue to accelerate. So the question is, this is to everybody, by the way, but I'm going to pick up on what Andy was saying there about, well, it's the Wardley maps isn't the magic bullet, if I can paraphrase what you said there. And I get that. And I think that's one of the things that's what may be causing, or it could cause Wardley mapping, the uptake of Wardley mapping, that could be the inertia problem that we have with Wardley mapping. But anyway, and I'm going to go back to gameplay as well, because in the complex, the idea that this is my future state, so these are the steps that I need to take to get there. We all know that that's kind of wishful thinking. That's not going to happen because the environment is constantly changing. And that's, to me, although I don't play video games or massive online, and I should do, it's finding the time to do it. But to me, I can imagine that when you start, the only thing that you can say to yourself is, I want to win. Now, how you do that, as you mentioned before, I think you've got a certain set of rules. You need to behave in such a way, you need to follow the rules, while the system itself is changing unexpectedly, and you need to adapt to that. So what I'm saying is, so that's the game world, you've got the set of rules. And what Wardley Maps does is it provides another set of, I wouldn't say rules, but handrails. So you've got climactic patterns, universal, context-specific patterns to look at. And then you've got the map itself, which is everybody can get around and innovate over and improve. So I'm wondering if we all need to be aware of emergence and how we sense that that's happening and the implications it can have. Because in a complex world, a small change can have catastrophic consequences. So that goes back to what you were mentioning before, Sue, about complex adaptive systems. So what I'm wondering is, although people could use Wardley mapping for their own benefit And actually, there's a blog post about this and say that they can use the inevitability of evolution almost to get their own way, while other members of the team who aren't as familiar with mapping or aren't as familiar with the domain that they're working in can then challenge the map to steer it in the right direction. But what else have we got at the moment other than using Wardley's evolution, starting with a genesis, ending up with commodity, and then how we see how other systems are built on top of that. So what we're trying to do, and the same's going to happen with human beings, we're going to move up the stack. That's what's going to happen with machine intelligence and automation. Humans will move up the stack, but we're going to have to learn as we travel up that stack. I'm waffling here, I know. But my question to everybody is, does the guidelines that Wardley mapping provide, mainly the evolution bit, help us all to adapt while there's nothing else in play? So it's a kind of, until they're experts in EVE Online, who can write articles about this is how to win in EVE Online and how to get your team to work together, you can only work with what you've got. And Wardley evolution is a good way of being able to cope with and anticipate emergence. I hope that made sense.
So something I'll maybe riff on real quick, that John, as you tie all these threads together, it's starting to kind of have a shape in my mind. And it's things like when Sue pointed out how the constraints of Wardley mapping, for instance, don't involve loops. So like no causal loops, it's all one direction. And what she mentioned about the Trojan horsing of this, and Andy alluded to hacking, right? And like finding ways to sort of help people learn without necessarily them having to deal with that initial steep learning curve or power dynamic. The power dynamic part was really something that kind of went ping for me, because right now, I think the current state of play is the way to learn Wardley mapping is either get Simon into a room with you or do a bunch of very difficult, frankly, learning on your own, where you're doing a lot of reading and trying to practice at the same time. Or it's get another facilitator or someone who's done Wardley mapping before to basically be the center of gravity for the learning experience. And that is very, I think, deferential. And it has to be right now because of the way that works. And that's not good enough, I think. And so what I'm thinking about in particular is pointing at how we aspire to say that Wardley mapping is about enabling challenge. And as Andy pointed out, it's not the only participatory framework. It's certainly maybe the non-facilitator, analytical-minded people's introduction to participatory frameworks, and that's great because we need that variety. But I'm just thinking a lot about, is challenge possible when there's a power dynamic of one central figure sort of getting people started? And I think it ties back to the question that the prompt that you just gave us, John, where evolution is, if we accept that as part of the rules of the game, right? Where this is the way that we're deciding to say the world works. In many ways, that can be a playing field leveler, right? Because we can apply the rules in different ways. We can create arbitrage. We can create asymmetry individually, and maybe that creates the circumstances for interesting conversations in the challenge. But I'm wondering about how Wardley mapping as a soft skill ties back into this idea of the power dynamics, whether challenge is possible. And I also like the aspect of play that could be involved with this. I think that's something to explore further, because the game might not just be about winning, the game might be about learning, and what does that look like? So a little bit of a kind of like jumble of really interesting thoughts that I heard from Andy and Sue and John, and I'm curious if anybody wants to riff on that a little bit.
I would love to chime in here about how you can sort of facilitate these spaces and navigate that power. Because there is, I mean, I don't know if you guys are familiar with French and Raven's 5 seats of power, but expert power is one of them. Like, not legitimate, but I know how to use this thing and no one else does, is a form of power. And I keep coming back to one of my professors in grad school who was amazing. Her name is Eleanor Duckworth. And her course, which I took the very last semester she taught it, was called The Having of Wonderful Ideas. And it was the most magical place to convene because of the way that she navigated her power. In that she was constantly abdicating it. I think she may have spent about 60 minutes in front of the room with everyone's attention the entire semester. And most of the time, she was giving us artifacts to just explore together. And there was a lot of discomfort around that. And some people dropped the class because of it. But you had this larger container, which is like, okay, well, if I'm at Harvard and this lady studied with Piaget, it doesn't matter that I'm sitting on the floor with a bag of peas trying to figure out, literally first class, we're all on the carpeted floor with bags of beans and Legos and all these things that she gave us. And it was so remarkable. I was like, oh my God, I'm at Harvard sitting on the floor with beans. But that was the structure. That was sort of the Trojan horse, that you're at Harvard. You must be learning something useful. And it was still very uncomfortable to not have anyone that seemed like they were in charge of what was emerging, what was being learned. And so back to something that you said, Andie, about experiences instead of, I can't remember what you said, if it was learning or ideas, like instead of a string of ideas that we're going to learn, it's, give learners a string of experiences. And she very much did that, not only together when we were convened, but also in between. We had to do field work. And the field work was intense because you would just have to go out, find somebody in a cafe in Harvard Square and be like, hey, here's a bag of beans. Will you let me watch you play with this bag of beans? And here's the ask, and they would get very uncomfortable. So you were getting practice in how to hold that space for someone else, just being asked to play. Basically, that's all you're asking them to do. But there's so much discomfort about what's the right answer. What are you asking me to do? I don't know what the ask is here. And so this, the building in of field work is something that's it's built into game. I mean, as you say, the lines are not drawn in gaming. Like, you are learning, you are doing field work. You are you're in the field, you're living in the field, even if it's a virtual field. So I know we're just about out of time, but I'm so glad you brought power in, Ben.
And I think for me, the other perspective where I find Wardley mapping as a perspective extremely useful is that this is just context, right? If we think of people with each other, we just need to do the work of mapping out the context. And it's going to be specific to the particular situation. It's not going to be that a particular method is going to work every time, or, sure, there can be some doctrine when it comes to designing for participation, and there is, and I can share some of it that I have learned, but you just have to do the work of mapping it. You have to do the work of understanding who are the people, what is their context, and how does that context inform, including power relations, like how does that context inform how people are able to collaborate? And that's where where it comes back to mapping in some ways for me, right? Even though it's mapping out those relationship networks is not necessarily, a straight up kind of Wardley mapping exercise. But it's that thought of needing to do the work of understanding the context instead of obsessing over the product or the method or something in the middle. You have to raise your your vision and your gaze to look at the context also in this type of situation.
So I'm going to bring the topic back now to Sue, because I'd like to finish off by giving you the opportunity to talk a bit more about your animation, but more about how can people get in touch with you if they would like to commission you or work with you or anywhere like that. Do you have a blog or a website, social media? And we're going to link to your Vimeo channel in the description. So if there's anything you want to say about that before we close off.
You know, I think there's a reason why I've gravitated back to the word artist, because artists tend to do their work first. And then if somebody wants to support it, they can, you know? And so I need other minds. Like, this kind of space is so rich to fuel the animation. So I need other people, but I like collaborating with other people. And I don't really sell my skills very often. Although I do for designing spaces to learn, to convene, because that is something that takes a lot of work, and it's not, for some people that may be their art. For me, that's not, that's like hard won, and I don't particularly enjoy it as much. It's much more at my edge. Sorry, that's too long-winded. The answer is yes, I have a blog, which I never blog on, www.sueborchardt.com. And the Vimeo is really the place where you can see my work. But I'm also totally game for having conversations and collaborating. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what comes out of here. In terms of if we were to reconvene and chat, I would love to pick up on what Andie said about, you know, while there's no magic methods, there is doctrine that informs how we design these sort of Trojan horsey artifact, whatever we call this thing, these spaces that we convene. And I think that would be a really fun conversation to have.
Well, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you, Sue, for agreeing to take part in this. As I say, I've been looking forward to it for a while, and it's actually turned out not the way I expected, but it's given me a lot to think of, so think about, I should say, and research. I'd also like to thank Andie for taking time out of your busy schedule. And I do hope that you two can get together for a second installment. You don't need us. It could be recorded. We can provide you with a Zoom and things like that, but I would really encourage you to do that. And I'm sure Ben would too. Okay then, folks. Thank you. Bye.
This was awesome. Thank you. Oh.